My key stopped halfway, and I could hear someone walking inside my house. I wasn't supposed to see the deed, but my name was already missing. The locks were changed overnight, and he was already living inside. I had 10 minutes before he got home, and the house wasn't mine anymore. There was a notarized document on my counter, with my signature I didn't remember signing. I trusted one document at the doctor's office, and it cost me my house. He told me it was for my protection. The county records said I gave everything away. I tried to call the police, but legally I wasn't the owner anymore. The moment I saw my daughter's name on the witness line, I stopped breathing. I thought I still lived there, until he refused to open my own front door. My key stopped halfway, and I could hear someone moving inside my house. I twisted it harder, the metal grinding against a lock that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like it had been replaced while I was gone. And the sound on the other side went still for just a second before footsteps picked up again. Slow and deliberate, like whoever was inside already knew I was out here. I knocked once, sharp, waiting for confusion or at least a voice asking who it was, but nothing came, just the faint creak of a floorboard deeper in the hallway. And that was the moment my chest tightened, because strangers don't move like that in someone else's home. I stepped back and looked at the door more carefully, noticing the deadbolt, brighter, newer than the rest of the hardware, and a thin line of fresh wood around the frame where something had clearly been changed, and I knew I hadn't done it. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I dialed him, because he was the only one who had a spare key, the only one who had been helping me organize things lately. And it rang just long enough for me to hope this was all a misunderstanding before it cut to voicemail. I knocked again, louder this time, my palms stinging, and the footsteps came closer, stopping just on the other side of the door, close enough that I could feel the presence without seeing it, and still no one opened it. The silence stretched in a way that didn't feel confused or accidental. It felt chosen. And I found myself stepping off the porch, scanning the windows until I caught movement behind the front curtain, just a slight shift, like someone adjusting their view without wanting to be seen. That's when I noticed the envelope taped along the edge of the doorframe, tucked just out of direct sight, like it had been placed there for me to find only after I tried to come inside, and my name was printed across it in clean, formal type. I peeled it off slowly, the adhesive resisting like it hadn't been there long, and for a second I just held it, staring at how official it looked compared to how wrong everything felt around me, before sliding a finger under the flap and pulling out a single sheet of paper. The text was dense, legal, the kind that makes your eyes skip before your brain catches up, but one phrase stood out immediately: recorded with the county, and my stomach dropped before I even finished the sentence. I scanned lower, my fingers tightening as I reached the signature line, and there it was, my name written in a way that almost looked like mine if you didn't look too closely, sitting above a notary stamp that made it feel real in a way I couldn't just argue away. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me flinch, and when I looked down, his name was on the screen like nothing was wrong, like this wasn't happening in real time, and I answered before I could think better of it. I asked him why my key didn't work, why there was legal paperwork taped to my door, why I was standing outside my own house reading something I didn't remember signing, and there was a pause on the other end that lasted just a second too long before he spoke. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as he said we'd already handled this, that I'd signed everything last week, and for a second I actually wondered if I had forgotten something important until I looked back at the paper and saw the date again. 2 weeks ago, the same day I'd been at the clinic filling out forms I hadn't read carefully because my daughter had told me it was routine. I turned slowly toward the window as he kept talking, something about protecting assets. And that's when the curtain shifted just enough for me to see him standing inside, phone to his ear, looking directly at me like I was the one who didn't belong there anymore. I stepped back from the door, my grip tightening around the phone as I tried to line up what he was saying with what I was seeing, and none of it fit, because if everything had been handled, he wouldn't still be standing inside watching me like this was a standoff. I told him to open the door, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was climbing, and he hesitated just long enough to make it clear this wasn't about confusion. It was a decision. When the lock finally clicked, it wasn't my key turning it, and the door only opened a few inches before he stepped into the gap, blocking the entry with his body like I was the one trying to get in somewhere I didn't belong. Up close, his expression was controlled, almost practiced, and he kept his hand on the door like he could shut it at any second if I moved too fast, and that alone made something cold settle in my stomach. I asked him what I had signed, not louder this time, but sharper, and instead of answering directly, he said we should keep this calm, like I was the problem standing on my own porch. I tried to look past him just for a second, and that's when I saw the hallway exactly the way I'd left it, my coat on the hook, my shoes by the wall, but something felt off, like the air had shifted, like it wasn't mine anymore. My eyes moved further inside, and that's when I saw her, standing at the end of the hall with her arms crossed, not meeting my eyes, and the sight of my daughter standing there like a stranger hit harder than anything he'd said so far. I said her name before I could stop myself, and she flinched just slightly, but she didn't step forward, didn't say this was a mistake, didn't tell him to move aside, and that silence felt louder than any explanation they could have given me. I held up the paper in my hand, the one with my name on it, and asked her if she had been there when this was signed. And for a second she didn't answer, just looked at him like she was waiting for him to decide what she should say. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I expected, careful, like every word had already been chosen. And she said I had agreed to it, that we had talked about this after my appointment, that I just didn't remember clearly. The way she said it made my chest tighten, because it wasn't defensive. It was rehearsed, like something she'd already had to explain more than once. I shook my head, trying to pull something concrete out of my memory, something that matched what they were saying, and all I could see was a clipboard in a waiting room, a stack of forms I'd skimmed while she stood next to me pointing at where to sign, telling me it was routine, telling me it would make things easier if anything ever happened. I looked back at him, and this time I asked directly if he had used that document to transfer the house, and he didn't deny it, just shifted his weight slightly and said it had been done within the authority granted. Like that phrasing alone made it unquestionable. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't something they'd hidden from the system. It was something they had structured to pass through it cleanly, something that wouldn't trigger alarms, because on paper it looked like my decision. I took a step forward without thinking, and his hand tightened on the door immediately, pushing it just enough to stop me. And that small movement made it clear this wasn't just about paperwork anymore. I was being kept out. I asked him if he thought this was legal, if he understood what he'd done. And for the first time, his expression shifted, not to guilt, but to something more defensive, like he had already prepared for that question. He said everything had been reviewed, that the documents had been filed properly, that if I had concerns, I could take it up through the right channels. And the way he said it made it sound like he knew exactly how hard that would be. I turned back to her again, hoping for something different this time, anything that felt like hesitation, but she just stood there, arms still crossed, eyes finally lifting to meet mine. And there was something in that look that made my throat tighten because it wasn't confusion or regret. It was resolve. Then she said something I hadn't been expecting, something that made everything else fall into place in a way that felt worse than if they had just lied outright. She said the house had already been moved into a trust, and I wasn't listed as the owner anymore, just a beneficiary, and even that had conditions attached that I hadn't seen. The words hung there for a second, and I realized I didn't even know what those conditions were, didn't know what I had agreed to, didn't know what control I had left, if any. I looked back down at the paper in my hand, scanning it again with a kind of urgency that hadn't been there before. And that's when I noticed a second page I hadn't unfolded yet, tucked behind the first, something thicker, more detailed. And when I pulled it free, my fingers went cold because at the top, in bold, unmistakable print, was a clause labeled capacity evaluation, followed by a statement that suggested I had been deemed unable to manage my own affairs. And I had no memory of ever agreeing to that. I stared at that line, capacity evaluation, and for a second everything around me went quiet, like my brain refused to process what it was seeing, because I knew I had never sat in front of anyone and been evaluated for anything like that. I looked up at her, the paper trembling in my hand, and asked when that had happened, and she didn't answer right away, just shifted her weight like she was deciding how much to say now that I'd seen it. He stepped in before she could, his voice steady again, explaining that it had been part of the same appointment, that I had agreed to a brief assessment, that it was standard for setting up the documents properly. And the way he said it made it sound small, routine, like something I would have forgotten without realizing it mattered. But I remembered that day too clearly. The waiting room, the clipboard, the nurse calling my name. And there had been no evaluation, no conversation about my capacity, nothing that even hinted at something like this, just signatures, quick explanations, my daughter's hand resting lightly on my shoulder telling me where to sign next. I felt something shift inside me then, something sharper than fear, because this wasn't just misunderstanding anymore. It meant something had been added, altered, or interpreted in a way I had never agreed to, and they were standing here acting like it was all clean. I stepped closer again without thinking, holding the paper up between us, asking him who signed off on that evaluation, who decided I wasn't capable. And this time he didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening just slightly before he said it had been reviewed and documented. like the details didn't matter as long as the outcome existed. I turned to her again, my voice breaking now as I asked if she knew about this part, if she had seen that language before today. And for the first time, her composure cracked just a little, her eyes flicking away from mine before she nodded, slow and almost reluctant. And that was enough to make everything else fall into place in a way that made my chest feel hollow. Because suddenly I wasn't thinking about one appointment or one document. I was thinking about the weeks leading up to it, the times she insisted on coming with me, the way she'd started answering questions for me before I could, the way she'd gently corrected me when I misspoke, small things I had brushed off at the time because I trusted her. I remembered the nurse asking basic questions, date, address, and how my daughter had laughed softly when I hesitated for half a second, saying I'd been a little forgetful lately. And at the time it felt harmless, almost protective, but now it sounded like something else entirely. I looked back at the paper, at that single line that changed everything, and realized this wasn't forged in the way I first thought. It had been built, piece by piece, until it looked legitimate enough to pass, until my own small moments of doubt had been turned into evidence against me. My throat tightened as I asked her why, not accusing, just needing something that made sense, and she finally stepped forward a little, her voice low as she said she was trying to protect what I had before I lost more, that I had been struggling more than I admitted, that this was the safest way to make sure everything stayed in the family. The words hit harder than if she just said she wanted the house because she believed it, or at least she needed to, and that made it worse. I shook my head slowly, the weight of it settling in as I realized there was no single moment I could point to and undo, no one signature I could take back, because every step had been something I allowed, something I trusted them with, until it added up to this. He started to close the door again, slower this time, like the conversation had reached its natural end, like there was nothing left to argue now that I understood, and I didn't try to stop him, didn't raise my voice, didn't push forward, because standing there I realized something that felt heavier than losing the house itself. That on paper, in records I hadn't even seen yet, there was now a version of me that wasn't capable, a version of me that needed to be managed. And they had already started acting like she was real. The door clicked shut between us, the lock turning from the inside, and I stood there on the porch with that document in my hand, knowing I could fight it, knowing I could try to prove it wrong, but also knowing that somewhere, in a file I didn't sign and a conversation I didn't remember, the story had already been written. And I didn't know if I could convince anyone which version of me was the truth.